You're listening to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. It's fast, fun, free, daily deep dive Bible, and right now we're working on the book of Nehemiah. If you're new, welcome. You can jump in right here, or you can always go back and start at the beginning of any season. The whole podcast is available in an easy-to-use format at thetmbh.com.
Yesterday, I was talking about the exploitative innkeeper in the Willy Wonka remake that came out a while back with Timothée Chalamet. And I was just pointing out how morally simple it is. You don't have to be some kind of ethical philosopher to figure out, wait, that lady right there is taking advantage of the poor and effectively enslaving them. Well, in that movie, kind of literally enslaving them. She is bad. You're supposed to be able to just figure that out intuitively. And really, her character in that Wonka remake is very reminiscent of the delightful but deplorable master of the house couple from the musical Les Miserables, who really do the exact same thing. They find people down on their luck and they collect them and they exploit them, all while pretending to be their friend and benefactor who feels their pain and is here to help. Looks like the same kind of people showed up during a very difficult time in Nehemiah 5, when you have, or really just all of Nehemiah in general, when you've got this awful confluence of a famine, a really heavy season in the history of the Persian Empire in terms of taxes, enemies at the gates, well, the burned out gates, that's part of the problem right there, wanting to kill you and thwart your work. And also all of the businesses are put on hold while you're trying to rebuild the walls. This is a crazy moment in history. And most people looked at that from among the returning exiles and they rolled up their sleeves and they mustered all of their gumption and elbow grease. And they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and they pitched in and they started fixing that wall, except for a few jackwagons who looked at that and were like, hey, this is a great opportunity to make money while appearing to be sympathetic, so I get social cred and money. I can turn every single sap who is working on this wall right now into my eternal debt slave, and I can harvest money off of them every single month, not by any incredible stroke of genius they might have, but simply by lacking the character and being willing to do something deplorable most people would not be willing to stoop to do in that kind of a situation. So it's an awful moment. Nehemiah is understandably outraged. Yesterday, we looked at Exodus 22, starting in verse 25. It says, if you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not be like a moneylender. Charge him no interest. Two things there. It means lending is not going to be a very lucrative deal. If you're doing it to help other people out in this culture, because they clearly understood that keeping people from falling off the bottom rung of the ladder was really necessary to making their society function and to withstanding the kind of tests that we're seeing come up all at once in Nehemiah. You don't want a whole class of people who are in utter ruin, but also you got to have enough community where everybody, rich, poor, in the middle, they're all pulling in the same direction. And these kind of rules are meant to provide justice, but they're also meant to create the foundation of a strong people group, a strong community set apart for the unique purposes that God had in mind for his chosen people. But there's more stuff in the Old Testament. We got Leviticus. I got to be really careful whenever I turn to Leviticus, because if I make one false move and don't pay attention to the chapter headings, I could easily accidentally read you passages about unclean emissions that will haunt your dreams. And by the way, obviously that's not the kind of phrase that even belongs on the internet in any way. It's a classy podcast. We're not going to go around saying things like unclean emissions around here. That's disgusting and gross and unacceptable. So you can anticipate not hearing phrases like unclean emissions every time I open to Leviticus. That's childish and stupid. Leviticus 25:35. If one of your countrymen becomes poor and is unable to support himself among you, help him as you would an alien or a temporary resident so he can continue to live among you. Okay, now first of all, that's pretty interesting, isn't it? That there are different designations of who we're talking about. This whole people group who's set apart and is ethnically unique and descended from Abraham and from these 12 tribes. I mean, this is a pretty unique thing historically. So I can tell right off the bat that that isn't going to translate perfectly to post-Jesus modern America. But we're not talking about that when we're in the book of Nehemiah. We're still talking about this paradigm, this context. Everything that was put in place in Leviticus, it is still in place by the time of Nehemiah. But even with that said, there's a distinction between people who are in this family of faith, the descendants of Abraham, and people who are visiting on really good terms, and a further distinction between outsiders who are not enemies, and a further distinction toward outsiders who are historic rival people groups or historic blood enemies. And as we look at this little passage here in Leviticus, maybe some of you are remembering back to Ezra, and some of that stuff where Ezra was all bent out of shape and picayunish about, no, your paperwork wasn't right. You don't have any part in the inheritance. You can't prove that you are descended from Abraham and from the 12 tribes. You don't get the full ownership, the full custody of this thing. Well, now we realize, dang, membership really does have its privileges here. I mean, in part because you're a part of the family of faith, the ethnic group that God picked to be a part of all of the promises and the covenant. And in the Old Testament paradigm, if you're not a part of the descendants of Abraham, I mean, there might be a very convoluted process by which you could become sort of an honorary Jew. But basically, if you're not Jewish, you're a part of a different people group and a different set of deals with God. This really was a very unique time. And then the membership has its privileges part. I mean, you're getting lending from your brothers and sisters at the command of God that happens without interest, and there's a built-in forgiveness mechanism of all debt every 50 years. More on that later. So you can see then why Ezra was like, no, we got to be careful with this thing. We got to be smart about who participates in rebuilding the temple, if we're looking at the stuff in the book of Ezra from the era of Zerubbabel, or who has custody of all of these promises, if we're looking at stuff from the era of Ezra himself or Nehemiah, as we are here. But the conclusion is the same. The expectation Nehemiah would have and that his people should have is that if one of your countrymen becomes poor and is unable to support himself among you, help him as you would an alien or a temporary resident, so he can continue to live among you. Do not take interest of any kind from him, but fear your God, so that your countrymen may continue to live among you. God is setting up rules here in the Old Testament to try to keep these people together and to try to give them a great chance of making it work. This is really important because if you also, like if you're God and you also issue an edict that is like, hey, I don't want you to intermarry with everybody else during this paradigm, this Old Testament era, well, there needs to be some kind of place that you can go, some sort of relief option from within your own people to solve a crisis if you fall on hard times, either because you were an idiot or because things just went wrong and didn't bounce your way. Otherwise, people are going to be like, well, there's no help for me among my own brothers and sisters. I'll go see if I can marry into some other people group, and maybe I can find relief there. So all of these commands go hand in hand. And again, it's very fashionable on the internet to find a phrase and be like, that's dumb. The Bible is dumb. I read a phrase out of the Bible and it's dumb. And look, I'm not against asking questions or poking at the Bible. It can handle it. What I'm saying is the more we look at it, and the more comprehensively you consider all of these curious exhortations and commands of the Old Testament as a whole, the more I think you realize how coherent and cohesive they are and how they all prop each other up to make a civilization, a culture, a people group that really was set up to be exceptional by the foresight of God and the wisdom of these commands, especially in this point in history where this was so progressive and so different and so brilliant that if the people honored it, really good things were going to happen. So this is a full-on prohibition on collecting interest of any kind. You must not lend him money at interest or sell him food at a profit. So even food, some states have no sales tax on food. I mean, it's a start. There should be more thinking like that, I think. Taxes get oppressive really quickly, and they hurt people with the least the most quickly. And the same principle is on display here. You can't even make money off of food. But for crying out loud, cover your costs, but take care of people. And if they don't have any money, find a way to get them food. The expectation is you are a family. You are all brothers and sisters descended from Abraham. You are playing a unique role. You cannot exploit each other. And, well, what authority do you have to make rules like this? Somebody might ask back to God as all of this is being dictated. I'm so glad you asked. Verse 38, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. Oh, okay. If one of your countrymen becomes poor among you and sells himself to you, do not make him work as a slave. He's to be treated as a hired worker or a temporary resident among you. He is to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then he and his children are to be released, and he will go back to his own clan and to the property of his forefathers, because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Look, these are big, complicated, important ideas, and I don't want to shortchange them. I thought it was going to be 2 days worth of conversation, but as is so often the case, I was wrong. I underestimated that, and so it's going to be 3 days of conversation. So for the second time in a row, I'm going to pause right here, and we're going to pick up right where we left off next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.